The village of Amuko lay cradled between ancient Irako trees and red, breathing soil, as though the land itself was a mother holding her children close. At dawn, smoke curled lazily from clay huts, and the sound of pestles striking mortars echoed like a heartbeat. It was a village that believed deeply in ancestors, omens, and the quiet power of the unseen. In this village lived a young woman named Zainabu, the only daughter of Elder Meduka, a respected man whose words carried weight in the council of men. Zainabu was known not just for her beauty, but for her gentleness, the kind that softened angry hearts and made even grieving widows feel less alone. People said her spirit was too pure for the harshness of the world. Her laughter sounded like water over stones, and when she walked through the market, children followed her like ducklings. She had eyes that reflected sorrow even when she smiled, as though she knew something the rest of the world had forgotten. The old women whispered that she was born under a restless moon. But Zainabu's greatest misfortune was not written in the stars. It lived under the same roof as her. Her three brothers, Obina, Kalechi, and Sadiq, loved power more than blood and pride more than truth. In their hearts, jealousy slept like a snake waiting to strike. Obina, the first son, carried himself like a king without a crown. His voice was loud, his temper louder, and he believed that leadership was taken, not earned. He often looked at Zainabu not as a sister, but as a shadow stealing light meant for him. Kalechi, the second, was quieter but far more dangerous. He listened more than he spoke, storing resentment like dry firewood. While Obina raged openly, Kalechi poisoned thoughts in whispers, planting seeds of suspicion that grew overnight. Sadiq, the youngest, followed where the others led. His heart was not cruel by nature, but it was weak. He feared his brothers more than he loved his sister, and that fear would one day cost him his soul. They resented the way villagers praised Zainabu's wisdom, how elders sought her counsel when disputes arose. She is only a woman, Obina would spit at night, yet they bow their ears to her words. Zainabu felt the change long before it showed on their faces. She sensed it in the silence when she entered a room, in the way her brother's eyes avoided hers. Still, she cooked for them, prayed for them, and believed love could heal what pride had broken. She did not know that the drums of betrayal were already being tightened. A dunny scream tore through the forest, sharp and desperate, but the trees swallowed it whole. Her voice bounced once against the thick trunks and then died, as if even the air had chosen betrayal. She crawled backward on the forest floor, palms scraping against thorns and dry leaves, her eyes searching their faces for mercy that no longer lived there. Blood trickled from her lip where she had bitten it in shock, and her chest heaved like a trapped bird fighting for breath. "Why?" she whispered, her voice breaking apart with every syllable. "What have I done to you?" Her brothers stood over her like strangers wearing familiar skins. Kahine's face was carved from stone, unmoving, while Taiwo trembled as if the ancestors themselves were pulling at his limbs. Sola fell to his knees, hands clutching his head, but he did not reach for her. Not one of them reached for her. Kahine lifted the stone with both hands, its weight heavy, but his heart heavier. For a brief moment, doubt flickered through him like a dying flame, and he remembered Adunni as a child, braiding his hair, sharing her food, calling him my big brother, with laughter in her eyes. That memory made his jaw tighten. He hardened himself, because guilt is a dangerous thing when mixed with envy. "In this," he growled, more to himself than to the others. Taiwo stepped forward, tears blinding him, his hands shaking as if they belonged to another man. He wanted to turn back, to run, to scream for help, but shame chained his feet to the ground. Adunni reached for him, her fingers brushing his ankle, and that small touch burned him worse than fire. "Taiwo, please," she sobbed. "I would die for you." And in a cruel twist of fate, those words became prophecy. The stone fell. The sound was dull, final, and unforgiving. Adunni's body jerked once, then stilled, her eyes frozen open as if staring into a future she would never live to see. The forest went silent. Not even insects dared to sing. The wind retreated. The world held its breath. As her blood soaked deeper into the soil, the earth trembled almost imperceptibly, like a mother flinching at the pain of her child. Roots beneath the ground curled around her spilled life, drinking it, remembering it. The ancestors turned their faces away in sorrow, but the spirits of vengeance leaned closer, listening. Aduni's final breath left her body not as a sigh, but as a promise. They did not speak as they dug the grave. The forest pressed in around them, thick and watchful, as if the trees themselves were leaning closer to witness what men do when they believe no one is looking. The soil was dark and damp, clinging to their hands like it did not want to be moved. Each thrust of the digging sticks sounded too loud, like a drum calling spirits that should not be called. Aduni's body lay a short distance away, wrapped poorly in her own cloth. Her face, once bright as morning, had settled into an expression of quiet surprise, as though death itself had come too suddenly to explain. Her hair was matted with blood and leaves, and a thin trail of red still crept into the earth beneath her head. Even in stillness, she looked as though she might speak again, and that terrified them more than screams ever could. Sola vomited behind a tree, his body finally rebelling against the sin his soul had already accepted. Taiwo stood frozen, staring at his hands, turning them over again and again as if they no longer belonged to him. Behind alone continued digging, his movements steady, his breathing controlled, but something wild had entered his eyes. He was afraid that if he stopped, the weight of what he had done would crush him completely. When the hole was deep enough, they lifted her. Her body was heavier than any of them expected, as though the earth itself was already pulling her home. Taiwo stumbled under her weight, and for a moment her head rolled toward his chest. Her cold cheek touched his skin, and he let out a sound so broken it barely counted as a cry. He almost dropped her. Almost. They lowered Aduni into the grave without ceremony. No prayer was spoken. No tears were allowed to fall onto her body. Kahind had warned them that tears would bind her spirit to the living world, that sorrow would make her restless. The cruel irony was that silence does the same thing. Silence teaches the dead that they have been forgotten. The first handful of soil struck her chest with a hollow sound. Then another, and another. The earth covered her slowly, stealing her face last, as if reluctant to let it go. When the soil finally closed over her eyes, a low wind rose suddenly, swirling leaves around the grave. Sola gasped, stepping back, but Kahind hissed at him to stay still. As they filled the grave, the ground grew warm beneath their feet. Roots twisted and tightened below the surface, wrapping around Aduni's body like fingers. The soil drank deeply of her blood, and somewhere far below, something ancient stirred. The forest did not forget. It never forgets. When the grave was complete, they packed it down and scattered leaves to hide the wound they had torn into the land. Kahind placed a stone on top, not as a marker of love, but as a command, stay down. Taiwo stared at the spot where her head lay buried and whispered her name without sound. His lips moved, but no forgiveness came. They turned to leave, but the forest did not release them easily. Branches snagged their clothes. Thorns scratched their skin. An owl cried once, long and low, and then again. Sola swore he heard a woman's breath close to his ear, warm and familiar. He spun around, heart pounding, but there was only shadow. Behind them, the earth settled, and beneath it, Aduni's spirit did not sleep. 12:45, August 1st, 2026, Adez. Night fell heavily over the village, thicker than it had ever been before. The moon hid behind clouds like a coward afraid to witness what had been done, and the stars dimmed as if mourning. Dogs whined instead of barking, curling close to their owners with tails tucked low. Even the crickets hesitated before singing, their rhythm uneven, uncertain, wrong. In Baba Adikunal's compound, sleep refused to come. Taiwo lay on his mat staring at the ceiling, his ears ringing with Aduni's last cry. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her reaching for him, her fingers trembling with hope he had crushed. Sweat soaked his body though the night was cool, and his chest felt too tight to pull in enough air. Sola rocked back and forth in the darkness of his hut, whispering prayers he could barely remember. He called on the ancestors, on forgotten gods, on anyone who might listen, but his words felt heavy and useless. Each time the wind brushed against the wall, he flinched, certain it was her breath searching for him. Guilt had begun to eat him from the inside, slow and relentless. Kahind alone pretended to sleep. His eyes were closed, but his mind was sharp, alert, pacing like a trapped animal. He told himself it was done, that the past was buried with her, that power always demands sacrifice. Yet beneath that confidence, something cold pressed against his spine, a fear he refused to name. Far beyond the village, the forest shuddered. At the place where a dunny had been buried, the soil began to move, not enough to be seen, but enough to be felt. Roots tightened around her body, not to trap her, but to hold her. The earth hummed softly, a low vibration like a mother singing to a wounded child. Adunni opened her eyes. She did not breathe, yet she was awake. Darkness surrounded her, thick and close, but it did not frighten her. She felt the weight of soil above her chest, the press of roots against her limbs, and the stillness of death wrapped around her like a second skin. Memory rushed back all at once: betrayal, pain, the stone, the silence. Her spirit rose slowly from her body, like mist lifting from water at dawn. She hovered above her own grave, staring down at the shape she no longer needed. There was no blood now, no wound, only peace carved from suffering. But peace did not mean forgiveness. Peace simply meant clarity. The forest greeted her like an old friend. Leaves rustled though there was no wind, and shadows leaned closer, curious and reverent. The ancestors appeared not as faces, but as presence, heavy, ancient, watching. They did not speak, because they did not need to. Adunni understood. They must remember, she whispered, though her voice made no sound. Her pain sank into the ground, spreading outward like roots searching for water. Every step her brothers took that night echoed back to her. Every lie they told themselves burned inside her chest like a slow fire. In the village, Taiwo suddenly sat upright, gasping. He had heard his name spoken clearly, gently, the way Adunni used to say it when she needed his help. The sound had come from nowhere and everywhere at once. His hands shook violently as tears finally broke free, soaking his mat. Sola screamed in his sleep. He thrashed wildly, tangled in a dream where the earth opened and hands dragged him down into darkness. When he woke, his throat burned from crying out, and the taste of soil filled his mouth though he had not left his hut. Kahin felt it too, but he smiled. He mistook the heaviness in the air for victory, for the weight of power settling onto his shoulders. He did not yet understand that some crowns are forged from curses, and some victories demand blood every night forever. As dawn crept over the land, the grave in the forest sank slightly inward. The earth had accepted Adunni's body, but it rejected the injustice placed upon it. Birds began to sing again, hesitant at first, then louder, sharper, as if warning the living. Adunni drifted above the trees, her spirit moving toward the village. Her eyes held no hatred, only sorrow sharpened into purpose. She did not come as a monster. She came as memory. And memory, once awakened, never stops knocking. Sleep no longer belonged to the living. That night, as darkness spread like spilled ink across the village, dreams became doorways no one knew how to close. Mats that once carried rest now carried terror, and every closed eye led somewhere it should not go. The air felt heavy, as if the ancestors themselves were standing too close. Taiwo was the first to fall. He dreamed of the river where he and Adunni used to fetch water at dawn. The surface was smooth, reflecting the sky like polished glass, but when he leaned closer, he saw her face beneath it, eyes open, unblinking, watching him. He called her name, and the water began to boil. Adunni rose from the river, dripping and silent. Her body was whole, untouched by wounds, but her gaze cut deeper than any blade. When she stepped onto the shore, the earth cracked beneath her feet, and Taiwo fell backward, scrambling like a child. He tried to speak, to apologize, but his tongue felt heavy and useless. "Why did you let me fall?" her voice asked, soft and aching. It was not accusation that broke him, it was disappointment. Taiwo wept openly in his dream, clutching at the ground, begging her to forgive him, to let him carry her pain instead. She only stared, and that silence crushed him. He woke screaming, clawing at his chest. His hut smelled of wet earth, and his mat was soaked as though river water had passed through it. Outside, the sky remained dark, but something had shifted. His soul had been marked. Sola's dream came next, and it came violently. He stood in the forest at night, surrounded by graves with no names. The ground beneath him was soft, moving like breathing flesh. From every mound, hands reached upward, pale and grasping, pulling at his legs. He tried to run, but the earth swallowed him up to his knees. Adunni emerged from the trees, her hair flowing like smoke. She carried no anger on her face, only unbearable sadness. She knelt before him, placed her hand over his heart, and he felt the weight of her final moments crush his lungs. He choked, sobbing, confessing everything he had never said aloud. "I wanted to save you," he cried. Her eyes softened, but her hand pressed harder. "Wanting is not the same as doing," she replied, and the ground pulled him under. Solo woke foaming at the mouth, his body shaking uncontrollably. By morning, his speech was broken, his eyes unfocused, as though part of him had never returned from where he had gone. Kahin did not dream. He lay still through the night, untouched by visions, untouched by fear. When he woke, he laughed quietly to himself, convinced that strength had protected him. He did not know that the spirits always come last for the one who believes himself untouchable. At the edge of the village, Aduni's spirit watched them all. She moved through walls and shadows, unseen but deeply felt. Her presence bent the air, made fires flicker, made elders pause mid-sentence without knowing why. She was no longer just a daughter of the land. She was becoming its voice. Children began to speak her name without knowing it. Chickens refused to lay eggs. Milk curdled overnight. The village healer felt a heaviness in her chest she could not explain. Something ancient had been disturbed, and it demanded balance. Aduni did not rush her revenge. She walked slowly through dreams, through memory, through guilt. She let sorrow do the work first, because before blood is taken, the soul must be stripped bare. And the village had only just begun to suffer. The sun rose over the village, but its light felt gray and hollow. Smoke from cooking fires curled lazily into the sky, yet the air tasted of ash and sorrow. The market that once bustled with laughter and bargaining was silent, save for the soft, uneasy chatter of those who felt wrongness in their bones. The earth itself seemed to sag, heavy with secrets it could no longer contain. Cows refused to drink from the river, and goats huddled in corners, their eyes wide and unblinking. Villagers whispered of shadows moving against the wind, of footsteps behind them when no one was near. Children clutched their mothers' skirts and said they had seen a woman in the forest, smiling sadly, watching the village as though it were a wound that would never heal. Taiwo could not escape the visions that had seized him in his sleep. Every glance at the village felt like staring into a mirror that reflected not only his guilt, but that of his brothers. When he stepped near the river, he swore he saw her face in the water, her eyes wide and patient, waiting for a confession he had no words for. He fell to his knees, trembling, begging for forgiveness that would never come. Solo wandered the streets like a man unmoored. Even the elders noticed him muttering under his breath, pacing between huts, fingers tracing lines in the dirt as though trying to rewrite history with them. Each time the wind shifted, he heard her voice whispering through the leaves, calm yet heavy, demanding reckoning. Sleep no longer granted him respite. The forest had taken it all. Kahind, believing himself safe, began to see changes that made him uneasy. Crops that had once flourished wilted overnight. The clay walls of houses cracked without cause. People whispered behind closed doors, their eyes darting to him as if they suspected the source of the misfortune. Still, he told himself it was coincidence, that nature and time alone were to blame. But deep down, the unease wormed into his chest. By nightfall, the village healer, Mama Ife, could no longer ignore the signs. She felt the pulse of the land as she had learned to in her youth, and what she felt was fury, the anger of an injustice buried too shallow, a grief swallowed by silence. She placed her hand on her chest and muttered the old prayers, but even the ancestors seemed hesitant to intervene. The spirit that walked the village was not just sorrow, it was demand, it was justice. The first sign of direct wrath came quietly. A flock of chickens dropped dead in the courtyard of Kahind's house. Milk soured in pots, and the wells, usually brimming with water, ran dry overnight. When he touched the earth near his hut, it was damp and warm, as if breathing. Kahind clenched his fists, heart hammering, yet he refused to admit the truth. Aduni had returned, and she was not silent anymore. Taiwo and Solo watched in horror as strange shadows stretched across the village paths. They moved without wind, twisting like smoke, curling around the feet of villagers, whispering their sins to anyone who would listen. The brothers saw each other, silent acknowledgement passing between them. They had thought her dead. They had been wrong. That night, Aduni's spirit drifted from hut to hut. She did not strike yet. She did not scream. She simply watched, and the weight of her gaze made every heart in the village tremble. Mothers clutched children, fathers stared at the floor, and the elders shook with the knowledge that a wrong had been done that could not be ignored. The forest hummed around the village, alive with her presence. Roots shifted under the earth, cracking clay, bending the land toward the grave where she had been buried. Every step she took resonated in the soil, every sigh shook the air. Aduni's return was slow, deliberate, a tide rising steadily against the shores of the living. And as the village slept, trembling in uneasy dreams, she whispered one name above all: Taiwo. Sola. Kahind. It was neither a curse nor a threat. It was remembrance. It was a reckoning waiting to unfold. Night came slowly, as if the sky itself hesitated to cover the village in darkness. Lanterns flickered in the huts, their weak lights struggling against a wind that whispered like voices just out of reach. The village felt smaller, tighter, trapped beneath a weight that no one could name. Even the elders stayed close to their fires, muttering prayers to ancestors who seemed strangely silent. Taiwo awoke first. The dream had returned, darker this time. He saw Aduni standing at the edge of the courtyard, her form blurred and shifting, like smoke caught in candlelight. Her eyes glowed softly, neither angry nor gentle, just impossibly alive. He wanted to call to her, but his voice broke, leaving only a strangled whisper lost in the night. Sola was next. He had been pacing restlessly, unable to find peace. Suddenly, he felt cold air brush his neck and smelled the faint scent of jasmine, Aduni's favorite flower. When he turned, she was there, hovering just beyond the doorway of his hut. His knees buckled, and he sank to the ground, hands clasped over his face, begging silently for death to spare him. But she did not move closer. She only watched, her presence heavy with sorrow and memory. Kahind's arrogance was the last to falter. He had sat awake, trying to convince himself that spirits were stories, that what happened in the forest could not follow him home. But then he felt it, a cold brush against his shoulder, fingers like roots entwining with his own. He spun violently, and for a heartbeat, he saw her full form standing at the center of the room, faintly illuminated by the moonlight spilling through the cracks in the walls. Her gaze cut straight through him, and he felt every lie, every betrayal, every ounce of envy crush him in one instant. The brothers gathered unconsciously at the center of the village. They did not speak, their fear binding them together, yet separate in agony. Shadows moved along the walls, stretching unnaturally, whispering their names over and over. The villagers awoke to the rustling and murmuring but saw nothing, only the flickering lanterns and the three brothers huddled in the square like children caught in a storm. Aduni's spirit drifted silently among them, untouchable yet all-consuming. She did not harm, yet each step seemed to carry weight. The soil underfoot trembled as if echoing her presence, and even the firelight dimmed in respect. "Remember," she whispered, a sound carried on the wind only the guilty could hear. Her voice slipped into Taiwo's ears, tickled Sola's neck, and made Kahind's chest ache with an invisible hand. The village dogs howled in unison, as though sensing her return. Livestock stamped nervously, water in pots rippled though untouched, and the shadows themselves seemed to lean closer to the brothers, amplifying every heartbeat and every pang of remorse. The world had changed, and the living knew it. Something long buried had come back, unstoppable and patient. Finally, Aduni retreated. Her figure dissolved into the mist of the night, leaving only cold air and the faint scent of jasmine. The brothers sank to the ground, shivering, fully aware that nothing would ever be the same. Fear had replaced arrogance. Guilt had replaced denial. And the first seed of revenge had been planted. From the forest beyond the village, a whisper rose through the trees, barely audible, yet terrifyingly clear. The earth remembers. The blood remembers. And I remember everything. Night fell over the village like a heavy shroud, suffocating and thick. Lanterns swung on their hooks, casting long, trembling shadows across mud walls. The wind moved through the streets in strange patterns, carrying sounds that could not belong to the living. Soft murmurs, crying, and the faint shuffle of footsteps on bare earth. Every house seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the inevitable. Taiwo lay awake, unable to close his eyes. Every corner of his hut whispered her name, gentle but relentless, a haunting that crawled beneath his skin. He felt the weight of her gaze even without seeing her, like a mother's hand pressed to his chest in judgment. When he dared glance toward the doorway, shadows stretched and twisted unnaturally, forming the vague shape of a woman standing silently, watching. Sola's mind had fractured. He wandered the village paths blindly, muttering apologies, trying to erase every memory of betrayal. The leaves rustled against him, whispering the words he could not bear to say aloud. The trees bent toward him as if leaning to remind him of the grave he had helped fill. Each whisper tore at his chest, an invisible claw raking through his soul, forcing his knees to buckle under the weight of what he had done. Even Kahind, bold and unyielding until now, felt the first cracks of terror. He sat in the center of his hut, eyes wide and unblinking. The walls pulsed with shadow, and the air felt alive, pressing against him with 1,000 unseen hands. Every time he thought he heard the wind, it was a voice, soft and accusing. "Why did you kill her? Why did you bury her?" He pressed his palms to his ears, but the whispers burrowed into his skull anyway. The villagers could not escape the effect. Children cried themselves awake, speaking of a woman with eyes like deep water who watched them while they slept. Chickens and goats huddled together, shivering, refusing to move. Even the river seemed uneasy, rippling with invisible currents that carried the faintest echo of a woman's laughter, sweet, sorrowful, and terrifyingly wrong. The brothers gathered unconsciously in the square. They clutched one another not for comfort, but because they were powerless to resist what had come for them. Every rustle of leaves, every cracking branch, every sigh of wind felt like her movement, her breath, her eyes burning into their backs. Taiwo trembled violently. Sola wept silently. Kahind's teeth ground together as his fingers dug into the earth beneath him. Then, the whispers grew louder. They circled the square, soft and sorrowful at first, then insistent and sharp. "You took me. You buried me. You cannot hide." Each word echoed in the brothers' hearts, carried in the wind, and bounced off the walls of the village, reaching into their bones. Fear had never felt like this, dense, inescapable, and alive. A chill passed over the village as if the night itself shivered. Lanterns went out one by one, leaving only the pale silver of the moon and the shadows of those who knew what awaited them. The forest beyond hummed, breathing in tandem with her, alive with the promise of justice. And at the center of it all, in the silence between the whispers, Aduni's spirit hovered. She was neither smiling nor frowning, only watching, only waiting. Her sorrow had become a weapon, her memory a net. And the first true night of vengeance had begun. Dawn arrived, pale and reluctant, spilling weak light over a village that no longer felt alive. The ground near the grave of Aduni had shifted overnight, small cracks snaking outward like veins across the earth. Birds avoided the area, and even the wind seemed hesitant to move. Something had walked through the soil, something unseen but powerful, leaving a mark that spoke of a promise and a warning. Taiwo stepped outside first, his bare feet brushing the cold dirt. He froze as he saw deep handprints pressed into the soft ground near the edge of the compound. They were too wide, too graceful, too deliberate to belong to any human. And within them, faint scratches spelled her name over and over, looping like a silent chant, Aduni, Aduni, Aduni. His heart hammered as if she were standing right behind him. Sola followed shortly after, drawn by the sound of rustling leaves. The leaves had formed words, delicate yet horrifying. "You will remember me." Each letter seemed to writhe in the morning breeze, impossible yet undeniable. He reached out, trembling, and the letters disappeared under his fingers, replaced by fresh soil that smelled of blood and earth. His knees buckled. "It's her," he whispered, voice broken. "It's really her." Kahind's house bore the first true sign of her wrath. The clay walls had split overnight, jagged cracks running from the roof to the ground, forming shapes vaguely like a woman with arms outstretched. When he touched the cracks, the walls seemed to pulse, cold and alive, almost breathing beneath his hands. He staggered back, realizing with horror that no human could have done this. Her spirit was no longer content to watch from the shadows. She was beginning to reshape the world itself. The villagers, too, could sense her presence. Milk in jars curdled instantly, and water in the wells rippled as though disturbed by invisible hands. Chickens fell silent, and dogs whimpered while staring at nothing. Even the elders, who had seen many omens and curses in their lifetimes, felt a chill creep into their bones. Something alive, something old and unforgiving, had arrived in their village. Taiwo's guilt erupted into confession. He fell to his knees in the square, clutching at his chest. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," he cried, tears streaming freely. The soil beneath him shifted slightly, as if acknowledging his words, yet there was no forgiveness in the movement. Only a reminder that sorrow alone could not undo what had been done. Sola trembled uncontrollably beside him. He tried to speak, but could not. He tried to run, but found his feet rooted to the ground, frozen by fear and something darker, an invisible force that reminded him she had power over all that was living and breathing. "We killed her," he whispered, voice barely audible. "We buried her, and now she comes for us." Kahind refused to admit the truth aloud. He looked at the cracks in his walls, at the handprints in the dirt, and even at the letters in the leaves. His chest tightened as his arrogance wavered. But he said nothing, shaking his head as though silence could make the reality disappear. Yet even he could feel the weight pressing down, the weight of a spirit wronged and unwilling to forgive. And in the distance, from the forest, the wind carried a faint, melodic sound. It was the softest of whispers, rising and falling, speaking not in anger but in sorrow, yet cutting deeper than any blade. "You will remember me, always." Every leaf, every stone, every shadow vibrated with the echo of her presence. The village, once bright and bustling, now stood under the first unmistakable mark of revenge. The brothers shivered, realizing the terrible truth. Adunni was no longer a ghost lingering in memory. She was a force of nature, unstoppable and patient, reshaping their world and bending reality toward justice. And this, the first sign of her vengeance, was only the beginning. Night descended like a shroud, thicker than any before, suffocating the village under its weight. Lanterns flickered violently, casting erratic shadows across walls and huts. The wind carried murmurs, low, sorrowful, and endless, spinning through the streets like the voice of a grieving mother. No one dared sleep, yet sleep found them anyway, pulling them into dreams that were sharper than knives. Taiwo's dream came first, vivid and relentless. He stood in the forest where he and Adunni had played as children. But the trees were blackened, twisted, their branches clawing at the sky. The air smelled of iron and ash. From the shadows, Adunni appeared, walking slowly toward him, eyes glowing like embers. With every step she took, fire spread across the forest floor, consuming leaves, branches, and memories alike. Sola's vision joined his in eerie synchrony. He saw his own hands covered in blood that was not his, smeared across the trunks of the trees. Whispers surrounded him, each syllable dragging deep into his chest. "Do you remember me? Do you remember what you did?" When he tried to move, the ground beneath him became liquid, blood rising around his ankles, lapping at his knees, forcing him to look at himself in horror. Kahind's arrogance shattered completely. He dreamt of his home engulfed in flames, the cracks in his walls widening into gaping mouths that screamed with Adunni's voice. Shadows danced in the firelight, forming her silhouette over and over, watching him, following him. Every lie, every betrayal he had buried inside himself was now visible, burning brighter than the walls around him. The village itself seemed caught between sleep and nightmare. Children woke screaming, pointing at figures no one else could see. Chickens and goats fled their pens, running into fences and colliding with one another. Even the river bubbled unnaturally, water rising in small geysers as if trying to escape the cursed land. The night had become alive with Adunni's sorrow and fury, and the villagers were powerless to resist. In Taiwo's dream, Adunni spoke, her voice calm but deadly. "You left me in darkness," she whispered. "You buried me alive with your hands stained. Now you will feel the world the way I did." Flames danced around her feet, yet she did not burn. Her eyes pierced through Taiwo's soul, making him kneel, weep, and confess his guilt aloud. His cries became fuel for the fire, his fear the wind that carried it further. Sola's nightmare twisted reality itself. The sky bled red, and the stars fell one by one into the forest. Every time he blinked, he saw her body rising from the grave, untouched by soil, her hair flowing like smoke over the blackened earth. The whispers followed him into waking, echoing even when his eyes were open. Remember me. Remember me. Kahine's mind fractured entirely. He could no longer distinguish dream from reality. Flames licked the sky in his vision. Shadows of the forest moved outside his windows, and every sound, the creak of a door, the sigh of wind, was her presence. He fell to the ground, rocking, whispering, shaking his head, trying to will the nightmare away. But the nightmare had already crossed into the village. The brothers awoke at the same moment, drenched in sweat, hearts hammering as if trying to escape their chests. Outside, the night remained dark, but the signs of fire lingered, ash scattered on the ground, scorched leaves near the forest's edge, and a faint, bitter smell of smoke that had no source. Adunni's presence was tangible, pressing down, suffocating, and relentless. Her revenge had begun in dreams, but it would not stay there. The village, the brothers, the living world, they were all now threads in her tapestry of reckoning. Every heartbeat, every whisper, every shadow carried her memory, and with it, the promise that no one could escape the wrongs they had done. And in the forest, the wind carried a single, sorrowful melody. It was the sound of a spirit wronged, patient and eternal. You will see. You will suffer. You will remember me always. Night wrapped the village in thick darkness, heavy and suffocating. Lanterns flickered violently, casting shadows that moved of their own accord. The air smelled faintly of earth and blood, as though the soil itself remembered what had been done. The villagers lay restless in their huts, tossing and turning, haunted by dreams they could not escape. Taiwo awoke to a strange coldness in his hut. The blankets on his mat had been pulled off, folded neatly at the foot of his bed, though he had left them in disarray. A faint smell of jasmine lingered in the air, Adunni's favorite scent, chilling him to the bone. When he opened his eyes, he saw the shadows of her fingers etched on the walls, stretching long and thin, almost alive. Sola experienced it differently, but no less terrifying. His mat had been shifted several feet from where he had slept. Objects that had been stacked neatly were now scattered across the floor, as though an unseen hand had passed through them. A small clay cup moved slowly across the table, stopping in front of him as if waiting for recognition. The whispers followed. You cannot hide. You cannot escape. Kahine, ever the skeptic, could not deny it anymore. He had woken to the sound of tapping, soft but deliberate, like nails rapping against the wooden beams of his hut. When he turned, the air itself seemed to warp, bending toward the center of the room. A faint outline of Adunni's face appeared in the darkness, expressionless yet accusing. His breath caught in his throat as he realized she had entered his home and touched it, marking him. The villagers began to notice too. The riverbank near the grave of Adunni was disturbed, though no human footsteps could be seen. Chickens refused to cross the paths where her spirit had walked, and cows huddled near their pens, trembling as though sensing the invisible hand that moved among them. Even the elders murmured prayers that faltered halfway, unsure if the words could reach her. In Taiwo's hut, the first true act of contact occurred. A small clay figurine of Adunni, kept as a childhood memory, toppled from the shelf and shattered. The pieces formed her likeness perfectly, down to the sorrow in her eyes. Taiwo's hands shook as he touched the fragments, feeling her presence like a chill pressing directly against his heart. Remember me, the wind whispered, and it was enough to make him weep openly. Sola's hut felt heavier than air could make it. A gust blew open his window, though it had been latched tight. Papers scattered in intricate patterns, forming shapes that resembled a woman standing, arms stretched toward the three brothers. He fell to his knees, sobbing, and felt a faint brush on his cheek, cold as the earth, her first true touch of the living world. Kahine tried to resist, tried to tell himself it was imagination. But when the fire in his hearth extinguished without wind, when the shadows in the corner of his room twisted to form her silhouette, and when the clay walls groaned under an unseen pressure, he could no longer deny it. She had entered his life, touched it, and left her mark. The village square was silent, yet alive. Footsteps pressed into the dirt where none should have been. Doors creaked open and closed slowly, and the soft sound of whispering rose and fell like a tide. Her presence had become tangible. She was no longer a memory, no longer confined to dreams. She had crossed fully into the world of the living. And in the forest beyond, the wind carried her song again. It was soft, mournful, and unstoppable. You will see me. You will feel me. You will never forget me. The first touch had been made. The warning was clear. Adunni had begun to reclaim the world from those who betrayed her, one invisible hand, one sorrowful whisper at a time. Night fell like a suffocating shroud, heavier than any before, pressing the village into silence. Lanterns flickered helplessly, their light trembling across the walls of the huts. The air was thick, wet with an unspoken fear, carrying the faint scent of jasmine and damp earth. Every creature seemed to sense the presence of something ancient and unyielding. Taiwo was the first to face her. He sat huddled on his mat, eyes wide, listening as soft footsteps circled the hut. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, forming shapes that mimicked Adunni's face and gestures. Suddenly, a hand, cold and weightless, rested on his shoulder. He screamed, but no sound came. Her whispers filled his mind. You left me. You buried me. You cannot hide. Sola was next. He had barricaded his door, piled clay pots and furniture across it, hoping to block her from entering. But when he turned, the room was empty of objects he had placed. Then they slammed down violently around him, forming a circle he could not escape. He felt invisible fingers brushing his arms, tracing every scar and bruise of guilt he had carried silently. The whispers intensified. You did nothing while I suffered. Kahind refused to acknowledge what he felt at first. He lay awake in arrogance, trying to tell himself the events were mere illusions, tricks of the night. But then he heard it. The slow, deliberate tapping of fingernails along the walls of his hut, growing louder, closer, circling him. When he lit a lantern, the shadows on the floor revealed a silhouette of a woman with outstretched arms, her hair flowing like smoke, eyes burning into his chest. Panic rooted him in place. The forest beyond the village stirred in response. Leaves rustled though there was no wind, and the earth hummed faintly. A soft glow rose from the graves of the village, small cracks forming near Adunni's resting place. It was as if the land itself had become her ally, awakening to the injustice done to her. Every heartbeat in the village echoed the rhythm of her presence, relentless and patient. Taiwo tried to speak, to beg forgiveness aloud. His throat felt raw, his voice breaking under the weight of terror. Adunni, I'm sorry, he cried. Yet the whispers did not relent, they multiplied. Her voice overlapped itself, surrounding him from every direction. Sorry is not enough. You will feel what I felt. You will suffer what I suffered. His body convulsed as if the air itself was pressing against him. Sola's fear became physical. He fell to the floor, clutching his chest as invisible hands squeezed and pulled at him. The furniture around him shifted, moving in patterns too precise for coincidence, forming the shape of a grave. The whispers became screams, rising and falling in waves that tore through his mind. You left me alone to die, he heard her voice, soft and impossibly close. Kahind's arrogance turned to outright terror. The fire in his hearth extinguished, plunging him into darkness. The shadows in the corners of the room moved toward him, solidifying into a shape he could not escape. Her face loomed, sorrowful yet accusing, and her hands pressed into the air in front of him, reaching for him without touching. His chest burned with guilt he had never admitted, and he collapsed, gasping for air that seemed stolen by her presence. Outside, the village seemed frozen in the night. The river shivered unnaturally, trees bent as though listening, and every animal held its breath. No one could sleep, and yet every eye eventually succumbed to terror-filled dreams. The night had become a stage for Adunni's wrath, and the brothers were the unwilling actors. At the edge of the forest, a single whisper carried above all else. It was soft, calm, and terrifyingly certain. You will remember me, always. And with that, the brothers knew the first night of true terror had passed, but it had only just begun. Morning came, but it offered no relief. The sun rose weak and gray, its light barely penetrating the dense air of dread that hung over the village. Birds avoided the trees, and the river rippled unnaturally, as though recoiling from the events of the night. The ground was littered with small disturbances, footprints with no owner, deep scratches in the dirt, and overturned objects in the huts. Villagers emerged cautiously from their homes, eyes wide, hands trembling. They whispered among themselves about shadows that moved without wind, whispers heard in the night, and chills that lingered even in the warmth of day. Children refused to leave the huts, clinging to their mothers and pointing at nothing, insisting they had seen a woman with sorrowful eyes walking among the trees. Taiwo stepped into the village square, still trembling. His eyes fell on the footprints leading from the forest to the center of the village. He recognized their shape immediately. Too large, too deliberate, unlike any humans. Each step pressed deep into the earth, and in some, faint scratches spelled her name repeatedly, Adunni. Adunni. He dropped to his knees, hands shaking, knowing the truth could no longer be denied. Sola walked beside him, silent and pale. The evidence of her visit was everywhere: upturned pots, clay fragments forming her likeness, and leaves twisted into her shape. He shivered violently, realizing that the terror of last night had been only a beginning. The village was now a stage for Adunni's wrath, and every living thing within it had become a witness. Kahind resisted acknowledging the truth at first. He inspected the cracks in his walls, the marks in the dirt, and the displaced objects in his hut, trying to rationalize it all. Yet when a soft breeze carried the scent of jasmine directly to him, he staggered back, breathless. There was no denying it anymore. Adunni's presence was tangible, deliberate, and terrifying. The elders gathered in the square, fear etched across their faces. Mama Ife, the village healer, spoke first. "The spirit has awakened," she said, voice trembling but steady. "She is not angry in haste. She is patient, and she knows every wrong done. Her sorrow has become her power. The land itself obeys her." The villagers listened in silence, unease rippling like a current through the crowd. People began to look at the brothers with suspicion and dread. Their actions, the burial of Adunni, the secrecy, the lies, were no longer secrets. Mothers clutched their children tightly. Fathers avoided their gaze. The villagers whispered openly about guilt and punishment. Fear had turned the community against those who had once been their own. Taiwo, Sola, and Kahind stood together, shivering, aware that nothing would shield them now. Every glance, every whisper, every glance at the disturbed ground reminded them that Adunni had returned to claim justice. And with each passing moment, the village became more of a cage than a home, holding them in place for what was to come. From the forest, a faint wind carried her song. It was soft, sorrowful, and yet sharp as a blade, threading through the village, reaching into the hearts of all who had betrayed her. "You will remember me, and you will suffer until you do." The day had arrived, but fear had already claimed the village. Nothing would ever be the same again. Adunni's presence had shifted the balance, and the brothers now knew the world they had lived in had ended the moment they took her life. By midday, the village was quiet, but not in peace. The air was heavy, tense, as if the land itself held its breath. Livestock huddled uneasily, refusing to graze. Chickens clucked frantically, then fell silent, their eyes wide and unblinking. Even the river that had always flowed gently now rippled with a strange, dark sheen that reflected nothing of the sun. Taiwo was the first to notice it. He walked toward the edge of the river, hoping for a moment of clarity or calm. But the water shimmered unnaturally, and as he leaned closer, he saw it. Small patches of crimson spreading across the surface, moving like living veins. The river seemed to pulse, almost breathing, carrying with it the unmistakable sign of Adunni's anger. Sola stumbled out of his hut in terror. The animals in the yard lay dead, their bodies pale and stiff, yet their eyes seemed to follow him. Chickens, goats, even the village dog, all lifeless, yet eerily alert. He fell to his knees, hands over his face, realizing that her revenge was no longer confined to shadows or whispers. The world itself was beginning to bend under her presence. Kahind tried to convince himself it was coincidence. He looked at the cracked walls of his house, the strange marks on the ground, and the water turning dark in the village well. But even his rational mind failed him when a small trickle of crimson ran along the walls, forming delicate patterns that spelled her name. Panic surged through him, making him stumble backward. This was no coincidence. This was punishment. The villagers began to murmur in fear. Some spoke openly about curses. Others prayed desperately to ancestors, though their voices trembled. Children clung to mothers, and even elders avoided the brothers' gaze. Everyone could feel it. The first true omen that Aduni's wrath was no longer just spiritual, it was physical, creeping into every corner of the village. Taiwo felt the blood omen touch him personally. He rubbed his hands over the crimson patterns in the dirt, feeling a cold burn as if the earth itself was accusing him. The whispers returned, louder this time. You killed me. You buried me. You cannot run from what you have done. His knees hit the ground, tears flowing freely, but no confession could stop the sensation of invisible fingers pressing into his chest, demanding remembrance. Sola's vision extended beyond the yard. The riverbank had turned crimson along its edge. Leaves floated atop it with faint scratches spelling her name. The ground quaked slightly beneath his feet as if responding to her presence. And the wind carried a chorus of sorrowful voices murmuring together. You will remember me. You will feel what I felt. Every step he took pressed into soft dirt, leaving faint handprints that weren't his own. Kahind realized their survival depended on acknowledging the truth. But pride and fear tangled inside him like vines. He could not speak, could not move, and could only watch as the village itself began to betray him, twisting under her wrath. Walls wept crimson, water turned blood dark, and animals perished without cause. This was not a warning. It was the first strike of vengeance, and it had only just begun. From the edge of the forest, faint but unmistakable, her voice rose. Soft, melodic, yet cutting like glass. Blood remembers. Sorrow remembers. And I will remember everything. The brothers stood frozen in the village square, fully aware that nothing could undo the wrong they had committed. The first omen of blood had marked their world, and with it, Aduni's revenge had begun in earnest. The sun rose pale, struggling to penetrate a sky heavy with gray clouds. The village fields, once golden and lush, now drooped under an unnatural weight. Corn stalks curled and blackened, beans shriveled on the vine, and cassava leaves wilted as though touched by an unseen hand. A sense of doom had settled over the crops, silent but deadly. Taiwo walked through the fields, heart pounding with dread. He knelt beside a stalk of corn, brushing his fingers over its blackened kernels. The earth beneath him felt alive, trembling slightly as if responding to Aduni's wrath. No, he whispered, voice cracking. It cannot be like this. The wind picked up, rustling the dead leaves in a chorus of whispering voices, all saying the same thing. You will remember me. Sola followed reluctantly, his face pale and wet with sweat. Every step he took revealed more devastation. Plants uprooted, footprints not belonging to any human pressed deep into the soil. A faint trail led from the forest into the heart of the fields, disappearing into a patch of burned earth where nothing dared grow. She's here, Sola muttered, voice trembling. She's in the fields, in the soil, in everything. Kahind refused to believe it at first, but when he reached the edge of his small garden, the soil cracked and split in intricate patterns, forming the shape of a woman with arms outstretched, hair flowing like smoke over the blackened earth. He could no longer deny it. His heart hammered, and he stumbled backward, tripping over the roots of dying plants. No, this cannot be happening, he whispered, clutching at the cracked earth. The villagers gathered slowly, dread written on every face. Mothers clutched children to their chests, elders shook their heads, and farmers stared blankly at their ruined fields. Whispers spread like wildfire. It's the girl, Aduni's spirit. She's punishing us, the brothers. Even those who had not directly wronged her felt the chill of fear ripple through their veins. Taiwo felt guilt twisting in his chest like a knife. Every plant that withered, every stalk that broke, every patch of scorched earth was a mirror of his own betrayal. He fell to his knees in the dirt, hands clawing at the soil as though he could pull forgiveness from it. But the earth remained cold, unyielding, alive only with her presence. Sola tried to rationalize, but the damage was undeniable. The soil beneath his fingers seemed to pulse, almost breathing. Every small movement, the swaying of dead leaves, the whisper of wind through the barren crops, felt like a heartbeat, and it was not his own. It was hers. Aduni had touched every inch of the harvest, leaving a warning that no words could undo. Kahind's arrogance finally crumbled completely. He sank to the ground, unable to lift his gaze from the twisted, broken crops. The air vibrated faintly with whispers, carrying a melody that chilled his blood. You buried me. You thought I would not return. Now see what your hands have wrought." He felt invisible fingers trail along his arms and neck, pressing into him with the weight of a spirit determined to claim justice. The wind carried a soft, mournful song from the forest. It drifted across the dead fields, reaching every corner of the village, echoing in every heart. "You will remember me, always. Every leaf, every stalk, every drop of earth shall remind you of what you did." The village, once full of life and laughter, now quivered under shadows. The harvest had failed, and with it, hope dwindled. The brothers knew that Adunni's reach was growing stronger by the day, and every moment spent in denial made the punishment sharper, the terror deeper. Night fell heavy and suffocating, black clouds blotting out the moon. The village streets were empty, save for shadows that moved unnaturally, stretching long and sharp across mud walls. A faint smell of smoke lingered in the air, though no fire could be seen. Every hut, every tree, every animal seemed to sense the coming terror. Taiwo looked up and froze. From the blackened sky, tiny particles began drifting downward, soft at first, then heavier, like ash from a distant fire. It fell in silence, covering the rooftops, the paths, and the fields, smearing dark against the mud and leaves. As it touched his skin, it burned cold, crawling along his arms and into his chest. "You buried me, and now you will pay," whispered the wind, and he shivered violently. Sola felt the ash swirl around him like living smoke. It coiled into shapes, fingers, faces, and finally her figure, floating just above the ground, eyes glowing with sorrow and fury. Every breath carried the scent of the grave and burnt soil. He could hear faint cries echoing in the distance, soft at first, then growing into the sound of lamentation, as if the entire forest mourned with her. Kahine staggered, blinded by the falling ash. It covered his face, seeped into his mouth and nose, filling him with an overwhelming sense of despair. Through the dark haze, a figure began to emerge from the center of the village square, tall, shadowy, hair flowing like smoke over her shoulders, eyes burning with a fire that was not her own but drawn from their fear. She hovered above the ground, arms outstretched as though embracing the entire village in judgment. The villagers cowered, unable to move. Every living thing sensed the wrath descending. Chickens huddled silently, goats trembled, and the river's surface shimmered unnaturally, reflecting not light, but shadow. Mothers clutched their children, whispering prayers, but even their voices were drowned beneath the silent song that rode the ash. "You cannot hide. You cannot escape. You will remember me." Taiwo tried to speak to the apparition, to beg forgiveness. But no words left his mouth. The ash seemed to thicken with each heartbeat, pressing into his lungs and mind, making every thought a struggle. The figure hovered closer, its presence bending the air around him, and her sorrow became tangible, heavy like chains. He fell to his knees, head pressed into the dirt, feeling her power wrap around him like the very night itself. Sola's terror intensified. The ash formed patterns around him, writing her name again and again across walls, roofs, and even the bodies of the dead crops in the field. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the night, absorbed into the mournful chorus of the wind. Her presence was everywhere, leaving no corner untouched, no soul unmarked. Kahine's mind teetered on the edge of collapse. He reached out to touch the apparition, only to feel his fingers pass through a chill as sharp as steel. Her eyes bore into him, silently accusing, silently condemning. And in that moment, he understood. Adunni was no longer a memory, no longer a whisper. She had become the living force of vengeance, reshaping the world with grief and fire. The village seemed to hold its breath under the falling ash. It coated the roofs, the trees, the roads, and even the brothers, binding them to the weight of her sorrow. The air vibrated with a melody of lament, carrying her words into every heart. "You will see. You will feel. You will remember me, always." And from the forest, deeper and darker than the village, a faint rustle signaled more than the wind. Something had shifted. The earth itself moved under her power. The night had become hers. The first true signs of fire, sorrow, and vengeance had fallen, and the brothers now knew that every breath they took was under her watchful, unforgiving gaze. The village lay beneath a shroud of ash and silence, suffocating in the aftermath of Adunni's wrath. Taiwo, Sola, and Kahind could no longer bear the weight of fear pressing against their hearts. Each step within the village felt like walking through a nightmare, the air thick with sorrow and accusation. They knew there was nowhere left to hide. Taiwo was the first to break the unspoken pause. "We can't stay here," he whispered, voice trembling. "If she wants revenge, if she wants us, we must leave." His hands shook as he tried to gather their few belongings, though the ash clung to everything, staining his skin like a reminder of the wrong they had done. The wind carried her voice, soft but cutting. "You cannot run. You cannot hide. You will remember me." Sola followed, panic rising in his chest. He stumbled through the blackened streets, eyes darting to every shadow. Shapes of hands and faces formed in the ash around them, reaching, accusing, reminding them of their crime. He tripped over an overturned pot, falling into the dirt, and felt something cold brush his cheek. Her touch, following them even as they fled. Kahind's pride turned into paralyzing fear. He dragged his brothers toward the edge of the village, toward the forest, but the trees themselves seemed to shift. Roots rose like serpents, paths twisted back upon themselves, and shadows danced between the trunks, forming the shape of a woman with sorrowful eyes and hair flowing like smoke. "You cannot leave," the whispers echoed. "You buried me, you left me, and now you will suffer." The forest, usually a place of refuge, had become a trap. Every step forward brought disorientation. Paths that should have led to open land turned into dense thickets. Branches stretched unnaturally, scraping against their faces like fingers trying to stop them. The deeper they went, the more the whispers multiplied, forming a chorus of sorrow and rage that pressed against their minds. Taiwo's courage faltered completely. He fell to his knees, sobbing, hands clawing at the cold, wet earth. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," he cried. But the forest only seemed to pulse with life, responding to his guilt with invisible hands that tugged and pulled. He looked up, catching a glimpse of a shadow between the trees. Her silhouette, floating effortlessly, unburned by the darkness that consumed the forest floor. Sola tried to speak, tried to reason with what he knew they could not see. "Adunni, please forgive us." His voice broke, swallowed instantly by the wind. The shadow flickered closer, tall and sorrowful, yet calm, with eyes that bore into their very souls. The forest floor seemed to ripple beneath her, as if reality itself bent to her will. Kahind's fear became terror. He stumbled over roots and fallen leaves, tripping into a small ravine. Looking up, he saw her hovering above them, her eyes blazing with a quiet fury. The ash from the village swirled around her like a crown, and the wind carried her voice clearly this time. "You buried me. You thought I would sleep forever. Now you will see, and you will remember." The brothers pressed onward, though every step was met with resistance. The forest twisted and shifted around them. Paths they thought they knew disappeared. Shadows stretched impossibly long and merged with the trees. Every whisper echoed with their guilt, replaying the memory of what they had done, turning each thought into torment. They realized that running would not save them. Adunni's vengeance was not bound by distance. Night deepened, heavier and darker than ever. Even the stars refused to shine, swallowed by clouds that seemed alive. The brothers could hear the forest breathing, and with every breath came her whispers, relentless, sorrowful, and accusing. They knew that no matter how far they ran, no corner of the world would hide them from her judgment. And in the distance, over the twisted forest canopy, the faint glow of her eyes pierced the darkness. It was a promise and a warning. "You cannot escape. You cannot hide. You will remember me always." The forest opened abruptly into a clearing where a river gleamed under the faint moonlight. The water looked calm and inviting, but the brothers sensed instantly that something was wrong. The surface shimmered unnaturally, reflecting not the stars above, but shadows of their own guilt, twisted and contorted. Every ripple seemed to whisper their sins back to them, louder than any voice. Taiwo approached first, drawn to the water despite a chill crawling down his spine. He knelt at the edge and peered into the river. His reflection stared back, but not as he remembered himself. The eyes were hollow, burning with sorrow and rage. Around the face of his reflection, he saw images of Adunni, her crying face, her hands clawing at the soil, the dirt pressed over her lifeless body. He tried to look away, but the reflection followed, mocking, accusing, condemning. Sola stepped closer reluctantly. The water moved with a life of its own, forming shapes of the night he and his brothers had buried her. He saw the moment repeated over and over, her eyes wide with terror, her hands reaching up, and their faces frozen in fear and guilt. Each reflection whispered, "Remember me. Feel me. Live with me." The river was no longer water. It was memory, accusation, and sorrow pressing into their minds. Kahind shivered violently, clutching at his chest. He tried to step back, but the river seemed to rise, swelling impossibly, reaching toward him like liquid shadow. The reflection of his guilt stared back, taller, wider, more terrifying than reality. It showed a Dunny standing over their buried memories, her hair flowing like dark smoke, eyes glowing with a quiet fury. "You cannot hide." Her voice echoed from the water. "You will see. You will remember." The brothers were trapped between fear and despair. Even the forest behind them seemed to vanish, leaving only the river and the haunting reflections. Each heartbeat synchronized with the pulse of the water, each breath carrying the scent of the grave. Taiwo's knees gave out. Sola fell to the ground sobbing, and Kahind shook, frozen by the horror reflected in the river. Taiwo's guilt became unbearable. He leaned closer, pressing his hands against the surface. His fingers sank into the cold, dark water as if it were flesh, and visions of Aduni's suffering filled his mind completely. He saw her eyes wide with terror, her small body buried beneath soil, her hands clawing desperately for air. His screams were swallowed by the wind, unheard, yet the river pulsed in response to his agony. Sola's vision turned violent. The water bubbled and churned, showing him his own hands covered in the dirt of the grave, the sticks and stones they had used pressing her into the earth. Every movement in the river replayed the moment they had silenced her, forcing him to relive the horror as if it were happening again. The whispers grew louder, chanting her name over and over. "Aduni! Aduni! Aduni!" Kahind tried to run, but the river stretched endlessly before him. No matter how far he stepped, the reflections remained, twisting with every attempt to escape. They reached toward him, voices overlapping. "You buried me. You thought I would sleep. You were wrong. You will remember me." He fell to the ground, sobbing uncontrollably, realizing that the river was a prison for their souls as much as it was for their conscience. The moon disappeared behind the clouds. Darkness enveloped the clearing, leaving only the river and the echoes of the past. The brothers could hear her voice clearly now, rising above the whispers, resonant and eternal. "This is only the beginning. You will never forget me. You will suffer until you do." And in the cold river, the reflections shimmered one last time. Aduni's face smiled, not cruelly, but sorrowfully, as if to say the reckoning had begun. The brothers knew that no matter how far they fled, the water, the forest, the air itself would carry her memory, haunting them until every heartbeat remembered the injustice they had committed. Darkness fell like a suffocating blanket, heavier than ever. The forest around the brothers whispered with unseen voices, the trees bending unnaturally, forming grotesque silhouettes. Even the wind seemed alive, carrying the scent of earth and blood, reminding them constantly of the wrong they had committed. Sleep was impossible. The night itself was a living nightmare. Taiwo's mind began to unravel first. Shadows danced across the trees, taking the shape of Aduni's small, terrified form. Her eyes glowed red in the darkness, and her voice echoed inside his skull. "Why did you leave me? Why did you bury me?" He pressed his hands against his ears, but the whispers seeped through, growing louder and sharper, like knives carving into his very thoughts. His breathing became erratic, heart hammering, as he stumbled blindly through the underbrush. Sola's torment was different, yet no less cruel. The river from the previous night appeared before him in flashes, reflecting not his own face, but Aduni's, pale, sorrowful, and accusing. Every movement in the water was violent, showing her hands clawing from the earth, her body writhing beneath the soil. He screamed, clutching his head as her voice whispered endlessly, "You left me. You buried me. And now, you will feel it all." Kahind felt madness creeping through his body like a disease. Every tree and stone seemed to morph into her form. One moment a branch, the next her slender arm reaching toward him. The forest floor shifted beneath his feet as if alive, and every shadow whispered his guilt. "No, "It's not real," he muttered, but his own voice sounded alien, swallowed by the echo of her relentless judgment. The brothers became separated in the night. The forest twisted, paths disappearing behind them, forcing them apart. Taiwo ran blindly, only to find the ground collapsing beneath him, revealing visions of her burial. Sola screamed into the void as her reflection reached out from the river again, pulling at him with icy fingers. Kahind fell to his knees, hallucinations of Adunni standing over their graves dancing before his eyes, muttering curses in a voice that felt like fire. The air thickened with sorrow and rage. It pressed against their chests, constricting, each breath painful. The whispers became voices, voices became screams, and the screams became a chorus of accusation that filled the night. Every rock, every leaf, every shadow seemed alive, echoing the tragedy of her death. Taiwo saw her face up close. It floated in the darkness, inches from his own, sorrowful and piercing. "You will remember me." Her words slashed through him like wind over fire. He tried to turn away, but the darkness followed him relentlessly, repeating the image over and over, until he could no longer tell where he ended and the nightmare began. Sola stumbled into a clearing, only to see their village burned and twisted in hallucination. Adunni walked among the ruins, her hair streaming like smoke, eyes fixed on him. He fell to the ground, shaking uncontrollably, knowing that no physical distance could protect him. Every step, every heartbeat, every thought was now bound to her presence. Kahind's fear turned to helplessness. The hallucinations had him in their grasp, showing him not just the past but imagined futures of suffering, where he was alone, haunted, and despised. "You killed me," the voices whispered, "and you will never be free." He realized the punishment was eternal, a nightmare stretching beyond the edges of reality. The forest echoed with her laughter, soft, sorrowful, terrifying. It was a melody that both mourned and condemned, leaving the brothers on the brink of insanity. They were no longer simply afraid. They were trapped inside a world entirely shaped by her grief and wrath. And from the darkness, one voice above all: "You cannot hide from me. You cannot run. You will remember me, forever." Taiwo awoke, or thought he did, in a dim, foggy landscape. The earth beneath him was soft and cold, smelling of wet soil and decay. Shadows moved unnaturally, and every sound, the crunch of leaves, the snapping of twigs, felt magnified, echoing like drums in his chest. He could see a mound of freshly turned dirt in the center, and his heart froze. The figure of Adunni appeared, pale and trembling. Her small hands clawed at the earth as if it were a prison. Her eyes, wide with terror and betrayal, locked onto his. Taiwo could feel every heartbeat of fear, every gasp of air, every pulse of pain she had endured. He fell to his knees, hands reaching toward her, but the soil pressed against him like an iron weight, keeping them apart. Sola was trapped in a vision of the moment he had struck the first blow. He saw himself lifting a branch, his fingers stiff with hesitation and guilt. Time stretched unnaturally, each second filled with the sound of Adunni's soft cries, her desperate pleas lost to the wind. He felt the soil crush against her small body as it was laid into the grave, and each grain of dirt pressed into his chest like shards of stone. Kahind relived the moment they had left her alone. Her eyes searched theirs for mercy, for love, for protection, and found only silence. He could feel the weight of the grave on his own body, as if he were buried alongside her. The cold, suffocating soil filled his lungs and lungs, her small hands clawing at him as if to pull him into her suffering. Every heartbeat was a scream. Taiwo could hear the whispers again. They were louder now, layered over each other. "You left me. You buried me. You killed me. You will feel what I felt." His own voice joined them, screaming apologies he had no right to give. The vision held him in place, replaying the betrayal over and over until his knees bled on the cold, hard earth. Sola's hallucination grew more vivid and cruel. He could feel the suffocating weight of every stone, every handful of dirt. Adunni's cries penetrated to his soul, a symphony of anguish. Time warped. Minutes became hours. Hours became a lifetime of witnessing her suffering. He trembled uncontrollably, his body shaking as if it were being struck by the pain of the dead themselves. Kahind's mind shattered under the intensity. He could no longer distinguish hallucination from memory. Aduni's face, pale and accusing, hovered inches from his own. Her voice was calm, yet eternal, echoing the words he had heard all night. You will remember me. Always. You cannot escape. Every motion he tried to make, every breath he took, seemed to deepen her presence, the soil now a prison of guilt and grief. The three brothers screamed in unison, lost in separate yet identical nightmares. The air around them seemed to pulse with Aduni's sorrow, vibrating through the earth, air, and sky. Every heartbeat was her judgment, every breath a reminder of the injustice they had committed. Their bodies trembled with the terror and despair of reliving her death. And as the hallucination reached its peak, one voice above all others cut through the nightmare. You buried me. You thought I would sleep. Now you will live in my memory forever. Taiwo, Sola, and Kahind collapsed to the cold ground, gasping, eyes wide, drenched in sweat and fear. They understood fully for the first time the magnitude of what they had done, and that the vengeance of Aduni had only begun. The forest around the brothers seemed alive, breathing with quiet menace. Even the trees were no longer passive. Their twisted trunks and gnarled branches shifted slightly, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward the brothers. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig carried a message, soft, deliberate, and terrifyingly clear. Taiwo was the first to hear it distinctly. A whisper threaded through the wind, calling his name in a voice both familiar and otherworldly. Taiwo, why did you turn your back on me? Did you think love could forgive your cruelty? The words slithered into his mind, replaying moments he had thought forgotten. Small betrayals, selfish choices, moments of callousness. Every secret sin he had hidden even from himself now clawed into the open. Sola staggered backward, covering his ears. But the whispers found him regardless, threading through his mind. Sola, you feared me more than you loved me. You abandoned your own heart. Shadows coalesced around him, forming images of his childhood deceit, times he had lied or hurt others for gain. The forest seemed to mirror these wrongs, the branches bending to shape themselves into his memories, while the wind carried her sorrowful, accusing voice. Kahind trembled, unable to move. The whispers reached deeper, probing his darkest fears and insecurities. Kahind, even your family feared your pride. You buried love as easily as you buried her. Images of past mistakes flickered between the trees, lost opportunities, broken promises, moments where cruelty had disguised itself as necessity. The forest was alive with judgment, not just for Aduni, but for every wound he had inflicted. The brothers realized this was no longer hallucination. The whispers were everywhere, threading through the air and soil, seeping into their very bones. Every step they took seemed to echo in the forest, bouncing back fragments of their sins. They were surrounded, cornered not by flesh or weapon, but by memory and guilt, given voice by her unrelenting wrath. Taiwo fell to his knees, overwhelmed. He saw visions of Aduni reaching toward him through the trees, her hands outstretched, eyes filled with sorrow and fire. You will remember me, she whispered again, and this time, it was accompanied by a tangible shiver, as if her presence had entered the forest itself. Each whisper of the wind repeated her words, filling his mind until he could barely think of anything else. Sola stumbled through the underbrush, trying to flee, but the trees themselves seemed to shift to block him, forming archways and tunnels that circled him back to the center of the forest. You cannot escape, her voice sang from the leaves. I see all. I feel all. I remember all. His heart pounded violently, panic gripping him, knowing the forest was now a prison of her making. Kahind's fear turned into helpless rage. He yelled into the darkness, demanding her leave them, demanding freedom. But the forest only responded with a chorus of whispers, repeating every shame, every sin, every moment he had turned from her. Shadows danced across his vision, forming her image over and over, until he could no longer tell what was real and what was memory. The brothers, each tormented in their own way, realized the truth. Aduni's vengeance was not limited to physical acts. It had infiltrated the mind, the soul, the very fabric of the world around them. The forest itself had become her instrument, carrying secrets, guilt, and sorrow to punish those who had wronged her. And from the depths of the shadows, her voice rose above all else. I remember everything. Every lie, every betrayal, Every heart turned from me. And now, you will suffer forever until you understand. The forest fell silent, heavy and oppressive, as if holding its breath. The brothers, broken and terrified, knew that from this moment on, there was no safety in the land, no escape in the night, and no sanctuary from her ever-present wrath. The village, once quiet under the night sky, was now restless. Shadows moved unnaturally along the mud walls, slipping across the ground like living things. Windows rattled without wind, and the faintest flickers of light traced shapes of a small girl wandering through the streets. The villagers slept fitfully, nightmares gripping them with icy fingers, even those who had done nothing to Adunni. Taiwo, Sola, and Kahind crept back into the village at dawn, hearts hammering. The air smelled of damp soil and ash, a lingering reminder of the previous night's horrors. As they walked, the shadows seemed to thicken around the empty huts. Each step made the ground tremble faintly, and in the distance, they could see her figure gliding past, her face pale, hair flowing like smoke, eyes burning with sorrow and fire. Sola froze in the village square. The central well, usually calm and reflective, churned with dark water. Ripples formed images, Adunni's face, small hands pressed against the surface as if trying to escape. The whispers followed them even here, clear and melodic. You buried me. You thought I would sleep. You were wrong. I am everywhere. Villagers peeked from their huts, trembling, sensing her presence even without seeing her. Taiwo tried to speak, to warn the villagers, but his voice shook. She's here, and she doesn't forgive, he stammered. Every word seemed to echo unnaturally in the air. A faint breeze carried her voice back to him, clearer than ever. I am the memory you cannot escape. I am the shadow in your heart. You will feel me always. The words sank deep, chilling the spine, and even the trees seemed to shiver in response. Kahind's fear turned to guilt-fueled despair. He saw a hut's doorway flicker with her image, a small, sorrowful face staring directly at him. It didn't blink, didn't speak, but the weight of her eyes crushed him. The villagers began murmuring in fear, some weeping quietly, others cowering behind doors. Her presence was undeniable, and it did not discriminate. Even innocence was touched by her haunting sorrow. The shadows stretched across rooftops and walls. Adunni's tiny form moved silently, appearing at each doorway, each corner, leaving faint scorch-like marks on mud and wood. Animals whimpered, chickens fell silent, and the river seemed to darken in response, as if the land itself mourned her wrath. The brothers realized the impossible. She was no longer bound to one place or body. Her spirit had become the village itself. Taiwo fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. He reached out as if to touch her shadow, only to have it drift through his fingers like smoke. You thought you could hide, the voice whispered, but I am in every wall, every stone, every breath of this land. He realized that no amount of fleeing or hiding could stop her. The village itself had become her instrument of judgment. Sola trembled uncontrollably, watching her shadow glide across the field. Crops, though growing again, shivered unnaturally as she passed. Leaves rustled though no wind blew. Even the sun seemed hesitant, breaking through clouds in thin, trembling streaks, as if afraid to shine fully on her wrath. The village, once a place of life, now felt like a tomb haunted by a restless spirit. Kahind fell into despair entirely. He understood now that Adunni's vengeance had evolved. She no longer needed them alone. She had grown beyond the grave, beyond the forest, and beyond human understanding. The village was a canvas, and her sorrow and rage painted it in shadows, whispers, and haunting presences that could never be escaped. And as night fell again, her voice carried over every hut and field. I am memory. I am sorrow. I am everywhere. You will feel me, and you will remember me, always. The village shivered under her presence, knowing the living and the guilty were now equally bound to her haunting. The brothers' terror was nothing compared to the knowledge that Adunni's shadow had claimed the world they had once called home. Night fell over the forest and village, heavy and unrelenting. Taiwo, Sola, and Kahind slept, or attempted to, on the cold, ash-covered ground. But the moment their eyes closed, the world shifted. Darkness became thick, heavy, suffused with the scent of wet earth and iron. Whispers echoed louder. as though they were no longer just in the wind, but inside their very minds. Taiwo dreamt first, trapped in a nightmare made of shadows. He saw a Dunny standing over him, small and fragile, yet radiating a terrifying power. Every word she spoke dripped like blood into his chest. You buried me. You silenced me. Now you will see the lives you could have saved. Suddenly, he was transported to a future where his guilt consumed him entirely. People he loved turned away, crops withered, his hands shook endlessly, and every heartbeat reminded him of the life he had stolen. Sola's dream was darker, twisted into a labyrinth of guilt. He found himself back at the river, but this time it flowed with blood instead of water. Faces of villagers and loved ones he had wronged appeared in the red current, pleading, screaming, accusing. A Dunny's shadow floated above the river, her eyes calm but sorrowful, whispering, "The pain you caused ripples beyond me. You will feel the consequences until you remember me fully." Each ripple of the bloody water burned Sola's skin like fire and ice combined. Kahine's nightmare was the cruelest of all. He relived every moment of a Dunny's burial, but each replay grew longer, stretching into an eternity of suffocation and sorrow. He could feel the weight of the soil pressing on his chest, her tiny hands clawing at him, her eyes accusing him over and over. Every sound of the earth sliding over her body echoed in his ears like a drum of judgment. "I am your shadow now," her voice whispered, "and you cannot escape me." The dreams merged, connecting the brothers in shared terror. They saw visions of each other, trapped in their own nightmares, screaming and clawing at invisible hands. A Dunny's small figure floated between them, a constant reminder that their sins had forged her into something eternal. Every heartbeat, every breath, every drop of blood in the dream world became a thread binding them to her wrath. When they awoke, sweat drenched their bodies. The forest around them was quiet, but the nightmare lingered like smoke in their lungs. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the crack of a branch, even the distant river, felt amplified. Her presence, though unseen, pressed against their minds, and they knew that sleep would never again be refuge. A Dunny had claimed their nights as she had claimed their days. Taiwo whispered hoarsely, voice trembling. We can't even close our eyes without her." The air seemed to shiver with agreement, carrying faint whispers. "You will see. You will feel. You will remember me." His hands shook as he realized that this torment would never end, not until they faced the depth of their own guilt and her vengeance fully. Sola shivered violently, staring at the dark trees. Every shadow seemed to pulse with her presence, every rustling leaf a reminder of her sorrow. The dreams of blood had shown him what awaited if he continued running or denying her justice. And deep in his chest, fear burned brighter than ever. This was only the beginning. Kahine's mind trembled, broken between horror and despair. He understood fully that the punishment would not end until they truly understood the weight of what they had done. Adunni was no longer just a girl they had buried. She had become a force, a memory, a shadow that would haunt them in every heartbeat, every shadow, and every breath. And in the quiet darkness of the early morning, one voice rose above all whispers. "You will live in my memory, in your dreams, in your blood, until you remember me completely." The forest was eerily still as dawn broke, though the birds no longer sang. Taiwo, Sola, and Kahine stumbled through the underbrush, trembling and hollow-eyed. Every step seemed heavier than the last. But soon, the silence was broken, not by wind or human voice, but by the strange, unnatural sounds of the forest's creatures. A sudden rustling made Taiwo freeze. From the bushes emerged a small herd of goats, their eyes wide and unblinking. They did not flee at the sight of humans. Instead, they stared with a fixed intensity, their heads tilted as if listening to something beyond the visible world. One of them bleated, a sharp, guttural sound that cut through the morning mist, sending chills down Taiwo's spine. Sola noticed the birds circling high above. They moved in chaotic patterns, cawing and screeching, yet their cries seemed almost deliberate, as though carrying a message. The shadows beneath the trees seemed to stretch unnaturally toward the brothers, and the birds' cries echoed in a rhythm that made Sola's chest tighten. It was a warning, an omen. Adunni's presence had seeped beyond shadows and dreams into the very life of the forest. Kahine's attention was drawn to the smaller creatures. Rats, squirrels, and even insects scurried and crawled in unnatural patterns, forming silent paths and leaving marks on the forest floor that resembled tiny hands reaching for the sky. A chill ran down his spine as he realized that the animals were acting as though they could sense her anger, her sorrow, her power. It was not just a haunting. They were surrounded by her influence, and the forest itself had become an extension of her wrath. The brothers tried to press forward, but the animals' behavior grew stranger. Goats began forming a circle around them, their heads bowed as though in a dark ritual. Birds swooped closer, shrieking, as if trying to peel the sky open. Even the river seemed disturbed, rippling without wind, reflecting shadows that were not their own. Every living thing seemed aware of Adunni in a way that terrified them. Taiwo whispered hoarsely, voice trembling. She's everywhere, he said. The forest, the animals, even the river. She moves through it all. A low, mournful howl echoed through the trees. It was not a wolf or hyena. It was a sound that seemed human yet alien, rising and falling with a sorrowful cadence, sending the brothers sprawling to the ground in terror. Sola felt a cold brush against his arm. He looked down and saw a small bird, black as coal, perched silently, staring directly into his eyes. Its gaze seemed impossibly intelligent, carrying sorrow and accusation at once. Then, with a flutter of wings, it rose into the air and vanished, leaving Sola with a wordless message that shook him to his core. She remembers, and she watches. Kahin tried to speak, to make sense of what they were seeing. Taiwo, Sola, it's not just the dreams, she's here, in everything. But even as he spoke, a flock of crows erupted from the treetops, their cries merging into one long, bone-chilling scream. The brothers realized that Adunni's vengeance had transcended the physical realm. She had claimed the forest, the sky, and even the creatures that lived within it. The three of them huddled together, hearts hammering, shivering in terror. Every rustle, every chirp, every movement of the forest reminded them that she was no longer a girl they had buried. She had become the forest itself, alive with sorrow, rage, and memory. Her vengeance was absolute, and the forest animals were its first heralds. And as the morning mist thickened, one voice rose, carried not by wind but by the creatures themselves. I am here, in every life, in every breath, in every shadow. You cannot escape me. The brothers stumbled forward, their legs heavy and trembling. They had no plan, only the desperate hope of escape. The neighboring village lay several miles away, and yet every step through the forest felt like wading through molasses. The trees loomed taller, their twisted branches clawing at the sky, as if the forest itself were alive and intent on stopping them. Taiwo led the way, though fear clouded his mind. Each familiar landmark they had known from childhood seemed distorted, rocks stretched unnaturally, the river looped back on itself, and even the path they had walked 100 times twisted in impossible ways. It was as though the forest had become a labyrinth, bending reality to Adunni's will. Every step forward only brought them back to the same spot, the same shadowed trees, the same sense of suffocating dread. Sola's heart pounded as the forest began to speak. Whispers rose from the leaves and earth, repeating in 1,000 variations, "You buried me. You silenced me. You cannot run." Every sound of cracking twigs became a hand reaching for him, every gust of wind a tug at his conscience. The forest displayed visions of Adunni at every turn, her small, sorrowful face peering from between branches, floating over rocks, appearing in the twisted shapes of the clouds. Kahin tripped over a root and fell into a shallow ravine. As he looked up, the forest above him seemed to bend downward, forming tunnels and arches that led nowhere but back to the same dark center. He could see Adunni standing at every turn, her eyes fixed on him, her voice echoing. "You thought I would sleep. You thought you could leave me. But I am in every shadow, every branch, every stone." Panic gripped him as he realized the forest had become her dominion, and there was no straight path that could free them. The brothers tried to call to each other, but the forest distorted their voices. Taiwo's yells came out muffled, warped, as if their echoes were being twisted into her presence. Sola's attempts to speak were answered only by visions of Adunni pointing, floating above the path, and Kahin's cries became buried beneath the earth, swallowed by the whispering trees. It was not just a forest anymore. It was a living memory of their sins, and every step forced them to confront what they had done. The sun, though rising, cast long, twisted shadows. Even in daylight, the forest was oppressive. The brothers caught glimpses of their own bodies morphing in the undergrowth, reflecting guilt, horror, and despair. Branches bent to form hands. Leaves formed her hair flowing like smoke, and roots reached for them like tiny fingers. Every familiar object from their past became a distorted reminder of the burial, every tree a witness to their crime. Taiwo finally realized they were being led. Or rather, the forest was guiding them, not to safety, but deeper into the labyrinth of their own guilt. Every choice they made, every direction they turned, brought them back to the same dark center. Adunni's voice now came not as whispers, but as a clear, resonant declaration. You cannot hide. You cannot flee. I am everywhere you look. I am the path, the shadow, the memory, and the silence. Sola dropped to his knees, tears streaming. Why won't she stop? He cried. The forest responded by twisting the path beneath him, showing him visions of every life they had touched, Adunni's suffering mirrored in every family, every friend, every moment of neglect or cruelty. Their punishment was not just for her death, it was for the ripple of sorrow they had caused. Kahind, trembling, whispered the truth they all knew. She's not just a spirit. She's part of the forest now, part of everything we touch. Every step we take is under her gaze. Their hearts pounded in unison, bound by terror, guilt, and helplessness. The forest itself had become a living monument to Adunni's pain and fury, and the brothers realized they were trapped within it forever unless they found a way to confront her fully. And as the cursed path wound endlessly before them, one voice rose above the twisting trees. I am your shadow. I am your guilt. I am your punishment. You cannot escape me. You will remember me until the end of your days. The air grew thick, suffocating, as the brothers stumbled forward. Each breath felt like fire in their lungs, every heartbeat a drum of impending doom. The cursed path twisted unnaturally, and the shadows deepened until even daylight could not penetrate them. The forest whispered endlessly, but now, amidst the voices, a shape began to take form, a figure, small and fragile, yet radiating a power that froze them in place. Taiwo saw her first. Adunni's ghost hovered a few feet ahead, her eyes glowing faintly red, hair flowing like smoke across the windless air. Her small hands reached toward them, not in pleading, but in judgment. The ground beneath her rippled unnaturally, and flowers, leaves, and stones lifted and hovered, circling her like offerings of grief and fury. Taiwo's knees buckled as he realized that this was no illusion. They could feel her presence, cold and heavy, pressing into their bones. Sola trembled violently. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, but his legs refused to move. Adunni's voice cut through the forest, melodious, yet filled with sorrow and wrath. You buried me. You silenced me. Now you will know my world. The wind carried her words, spinning them into physical force. Sola was lifted off the ground for a heartbeat, as though the air itself had become her hand, her judgment tangible and terrifying. Kahind's scream joined theirs. Adunni's apparition drifted closer, and reality itself seemed to bend around her. Trees warped, roots twisted into grotesque hands, and shadows slithered across the ground in impossible angles. The earth under their feet felt like water, rising and falling with her movement. Her gaze pierced them, showing every secret sin, every moment of cruelty, every lie they had told themselves to feel safe. You will feel me, in every breath, in every heartbeat, forever. The forest itself obeyed her. Leaves rose in spirals around her, forming a vortex of grief and rage. The air shimmered as if boiling, carrying whispers of her pain in 1,000 voices. Every animal they had passed earlier appeared briefly, eyes glowing, circling her in silent obedience. The brothers realized they were not just witnesses, they were trapped within her power, puppets in the performance of her vengeance. Taiwo fell face first to the ground, gasping for air. Sola grabbed him, but his own hands trembled uncontrollably. Kahind's eyes widened in horror as Adunni extended her small hands toward them. Shadows flowed from her fingertips like black water, wrapping around their bodies, pressing into their skin, burning with cold. They could feel their hearts racing, their memories twisting, their guilt solidifying into something tangible, something that could never be ignored. Her voice rang above the chaos, clear and unyielding. You thought burying me would end me. But I am the memory you cannot escape, the shadow you cannot hide from, the judgment you cannot withstand. I am here, and I will never leave. Every word struck like a hammer against their skulls, echoing across the warped forest, leaving them shaking and broken. The brothers collapsed, huddling together, unable to comprehend the magnitude of her presence. They realized, fully for the first time, that Adunni was no longer a spirit confined to the grave, the forest, or their nightmares. She had become a force, a living embodiment of grief, sorrow, and vengeance, bending reality to her will, and they were utterly powerless before her. And as the shadows spiraled higher and the wind carried her voice like a storm, one truth became undeniable. I am everywhere. I am your shadow, and you will remember me until your last breath. The forest trembled with a low, mournful hum, vibrating through the brothers' bones. Taiwo, Sola, and Kahind huddled together, eyes wide and unblinking, hearts hammering as Adunni's apparition floated above them. Every shadow twisted unnaturally, stretching and reaching like living hands, while the wind whispered her voice. You cannot hide. You cannot escape. I am your memory, your guilt, your punishment. Taiwo was the first to falter. The shadows seemed to coil around his legs, wrapping tighter with each heartbeat. Images of Adunni's burial, her small, pleading eyes, her fragile hands clawing at the earth, replayed endlessly in his mind. He screamed, clutching his head as if to tear the visions from his skull. But the visions burrowed deeper, stronger, impossible to escape. You left me. You buried me. Now you will know fear like mine. Her voice rang, cutting through him like a knife. Sola tried to pull him up, but it was no use. Taiwo's body went rigid, trembling violently. His eyes rolled back, mouth opening in a silent scream, as the shadows lifted him slightly off the ground. Adunni's form hovered closer, her small hand reaching toward his chest, and suddenly, he gasped in pure terror, collapsing to the ground in convulsions. I am everywhere. I am in your blood. I am in your fear. Her whispers enveloped him entirely, leaving him motionless and pale. Kahind's horror reached a peak. He realized the moment that one of them, the eldest, the leader, was gone. Taiwo's body lay still, a puppet of terror and sorrow, while Adunni's gaze shifted to Sola and Kahind, eyes glimmering with calm fury. One has felt the weight of my sorrow. One has joined me in my world. Next, it will be you. The forest seemed to bow toward her, bending trees, roots, and shadows to highlight her power. Sola's knees buckled as tears streamed down his face. Taiwo, no. Wake up, he screamed, shaking his brother violently. But the shadows around Taiwo only tightened, and the air grew colder, heavier. He could feel her presence pressing against him, pulling at his soul, testing the limits of his courage. Adunni's voice echoed again, soft yet deadly. Fear me, and understand what you have done. Kahind staggered backward, trembling uncontrollably. The forest's animals, once passive witnesses, now gathered, their eyes glowing like embers in the dark underbrush. Crows screeched overhead, goats bared teeth and hissed, and every rustle of leaves became a warning of approaching doom. I will claim you all in body and spirit, until my memory is honored. Each word of the voice forced his knees to buckle, his chest tightening as if the air itself had become a cage. Taiwo's body lay unmoving, and Sola's hands shook violently. The weight of Adunni's judgment pressed on them like stone. They could feel her presence inside their minds, inside their very veins, burning guilt into their hearts. One brother had already fallen, giving her the first tangible victory, a warning that her wrath was not only spiritual but also physical, unstoppable, and inescapable. The forest was silent for a heartbeat. Then her voice rose again, strong and echoing, resonating through every branch, root, and stone. One has fallen, and the others will follow, step by step, until you remember me completely. The brothers' breaths came in ragged gasps, terror rooting them to the spot, their bodies weak, their minds trembling. And as shadows stretched toward the remaining two, Adunni's laughter, soft, sorrowful, and terrifying, filled the air. It was the sound of a soul scorned, a girl betrayed, and a force that had transcended death. The first brother had fallen, but the nightmare was only beginning. Sola and Kahin stumbled forward, hearts hammering like war drums. The forest, alive with Aduni's presence, seemed to pulse around them. Shadows stretched unnaturally, bending toward their bodies as if the trees themselves were reaching out to hold them. Every branch scraped at their skin, every rustle whispered her name. You cannot flee. You cannot hide. I am your shadow. Sola tripped over a gnarled root and fell hard. The ground beneath him rippled, and in the trembling earth, he saw the imprint of Aduni's small hands, fresh and bloody, pressing into the soil as if reaching for him. Panic clawed his throat, and he scrambled to his feet, only to find that the path they had been following had twisted. The forest had rearranged itself, forcing them back toward the dark center where Taiwo had fallen. Kahin's chest tightened with suffocating fear. Branches bent and intertwined, forming archways that narrowed the path, forcing them closer together. Shadows danced around their feet, flickering like faces, Aduni's face, pleading, accusing, and laughing. Her voice carried over every sound, calm yet merciless. I am in every step you take, every breath you draw, and you will never be free of me. Sola glanced behind and froze. Through the thick mist of the forest, he saw dozens of black shapes moving toward them. Not animals, not people, but shadows, like echoes of Aduni herself, mimicking her every movement. They pressed closer, whispering memories of betrayal and fear into his mind. His knees buckled, but Kahin grabbed him, dragging him forward as the shadows slithered across the ground toward them like liquid darkness. The brothers ran blindly through the forest. The trees twisted, the roots tangled beneath their feet, and the path seemed to shift at every step. One moment they were moving forward. The next they were back at the clearing where Taiwo had fallen. Every direction they chose led to the same suffocating center, and Aduni's voice followed, now sharper, more piercing. One has fallen. Now you will feel the weight of my memory, as I did. Sola stumbled into a patch of fog. It rose around him like smoke, thick and choking, forming the figure of Aduni before he could even see her face. Her eyes burned with sorrow and rage. She held out a hand, and the shadows wrapped around his legs, pulling him toward her, forcing him to feel the exact fear and helplessness she had felt in her final moments. Every heartbeat of terror synced with hers. Every breath, he took a reminder of the life they had stolen. Kahin fought to pull him free, but the forest seemed to resist. Trees bent inward, roots coiling like snakes, shadows swirling like water around them. Aduni's laughter echoed in their ears, high-pitched and sorrowful, carrying the weight of a girl betrayed and a spirit denied peace. The brothers realized that even together, they could not resist. Her power had made the forest itself an extension of her wrath. The mist thickened, obscuring all light. They could no longer see more than a few feet ahead. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, the whisper of the wind, was magnified, each carrying her judgment. The forest had closed in completely, her presence inescapable, pressing on them from all sides. And above it all, her voice rose louder than the storm of shadows and mist. You cannot run, you cannot hide. I am the memory you buried, and now, you will live in it, forever. The brothers pressed together, trembling, trapped in the forest's nightmare, with no path to safety and no hope of escape. Kahin and Sola stumbled forward, the forest pressing in on all sides. Every tree seemed alive, every shadow a living hand reaching for them. The ground underfoot rippled unnaturally, and the air carried whispers that dug into their minds. Aduni's voice, soft yet unyielding, filled the forest. One has fallen. Now the next will feel my sorrow, my rage, my memory. Sola faltered first. He tripped over a twisting root, his hands scraping the cold, wet earth. Shadows slithered over him, rising like dark smoke and coiling around his limbs. Images of Aduni's final moments flooded his mind, her small hands clawing at the soil, her terrified eyes staring at him, the pain and betrayal of her final breaths. His screams echoed through the forest, but no sound came from Kahin. Kahin reached for him desperately. Sola, fight it. Don't give her this power. But the shadows held him tightly, and Aduni's apparition hovered above, calm and sorrowful, her eyes piercing Sola's very soul. You will feel what I felt, the fear, the helplessness, the betrayal, until you understand. Each word burned into Sola's mind, twisting his own guilt into a living nightmare he could not escape. Sola's body trembled violently, convulsing as though every nerve had been struck by fire. His eyes rolled back, seeing visions of the village, of the forest, of every wrong he had done to her and others. Each memory was magnified, her suffering etched over every scene. He screamed silently, unable to move, unable to cry, unable to even breathe properly. Aduni's shadow surrounded him fully, her small hand pressing down on his chest, weightless yet suffocating. Kahind stumbled backward, gasping for breath. The weight of terror pressed on him like stones on his shoulders. He realized fully that Aduni was no longer a girl they had buried, but a force of nature itself. Her vengeance had become absolute, her wrath a physical, spiritual, and emotional cage. The forest, the animals, even the air, all were her instruments. He fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. Her voice wrapped around him like smoke, filling his ears, his mind, his heart. I am everywhere. In every shadow, every step, every heartbeat, until you remember me fully, until you feel my sorrow as I felt it. The forest grew deathly silent for a moment, thick with anticipation. Kahind, alone, realized that he was the final brother standing, and the full force of Aduni's wrath was now directed at him alone. His fears surged, mingled with guilt and despair, as the mist and shadows of the forest thickened, bending reality around him in preparation for the ultimate reckoning. And above the swirling shadows and roots, her tiny voice echoed like a storm. You will fall, as they have, and you will remember me, forever. Kahind's knees sank into the soft, trembling earth of the forest. All around him, shadows twisted like living serpents, and the mist hung thick as a curtain, muffling every sound except her voice. You buried me. You silenced me. Now face me, fully. His heart raced, every beat echoing in his skull like a drum of judgment. Aduni's ghost hovered in front of him, small and fragile, yet terrifying. Her eyes, red-rimmed and blazing with sorrow, bore into Kahind's soul. The forest bent and warped around her, leaves swirling like black feathers, branches reaching as if to touch him, roots curling toward his legs. Her tiny hands stretched outward, palms glowing faintly with a cold, pale light. Do you see what you have done? Do you feel it? Kahind's voice trembled, barely audible. I'm sorry, Aduni. I never meant. The words died in his throat. Every apology felt useless. Shadows wrapped tighter around him, forcing him to relive her final moments over and over. He saw her tiny body pressed into the soil, hands clawing at the earth, her eyes wide with fear and disbelief at the cruelty of her brothers. Aduni's sorrow became almost tangible. It pressed against his chest, a living weight. The forest seemed to echo her pain. Leaves rustled as if crying. The river's surface shivered violently, and distant cries of animals formed a mournful chorus. You thought burying me would erase me. You were wrong. Every step you take, every breath you draw, is mine to claim. Kahind fell to the ground, sobbing. Please. I remember you. I feel your pain, he whispered. The shadows recoiled slightly, the trees bending back, but her gaze remained sharp, unyielding. Remember me, truly. Understand my suffering, or your torment will last forever. It was a plea, not for forgiveness, but for recognition. The mist swirled into her figure, growing taller, more imposing. Kahind realized she was no longer just a child spirit. She had grown into a force shaped by grief and betrayal. Every part of the forest resonated with her memory. Roots lifted like hands, branches curled toward him, and the wind carried whispers of every heartbeat of every day she had been alive. Kahind's hands clenched the earth, tears streaming. I remember. I feel, he choked. The forest stilled slightly, as if listening. Aduni's ghost hovered silently, her rage cooling slightly, sorrow replacing some of the fire. Then you may walk. But remember me. Always, her words lingered, echoing through the trees and mist, leaving Kahind trembling, hollowed, and forever changed. The forest seemed to pause. Leaves stopped moving, shadows stilled, and the mist lifted slightly. Kahind looked around, trembling, and noticed that the twisted trees no longer reached toward him. Her voice softened, but it was still everywhere. Remember me, so that no one else will suffer like I did. The air lightened, carrying the faint smell of wet earth and flowers. Adunni's figure grew faint, almost fading into the mist. Kahind fell to his knees, breathing hard, realizing he had survived the confrontation. But the forest retained a whisper of her presence, a reminder that she had left an indelible mark on him and the world around him. The sun broke through the trees in timid streaks of gold. It illuminated the clearing where Taiwo and Sola had fallen. Their bodies lay pale but untouched by decay. Kahind's heart wrenched as he approached them, touching his brothers, feeling the emptiness of their terror. Adunni had claimed them, but her vengeance was not mindless. It was a demand for memory and recognition. Kahind understood the forest's lesson. This was no longer just about revenge. It was about justice, sorrow, and remembrance. He bowed his head to the quiet forest, whispering apologies to the wind, the shadows, and the spirit of his sister. I will remember. I will honor you. Her voice, distant but firm, carried one last warning. Never forget, and tell others, so that my sorrow is not repeated. And with that, the mist dissipated fully, leaving Kahind alone with his grief and the ruins of the path they had traveled. Kahind stepped cautiously through the forest, the weight of the ordeal pressing against his chest. The mist had lifted, but the trees still seemed alive, bending slightly as if acknowledging him. Every step was a reminder of the terror he had survived and the brothers he could not save. He felt their absence in the crunch of leaves underfoot, in the stillness of the air. Every shadow seemed to whisper her name. Adunni's presence lingered, not as wrath now, but as a solemn reminder of her life and suffering. Kahind closed his eyes, imagining her small face, wide with fear the day they had betrayed her. His steps faltered as waves of grief and guilt rolled over him. The forest was quiet, yet alive with memory. The birds had returned, cautiously, their songs tentative. The wind carried soft whispers, not cruel now, but mournful. Kahind realized that Adunni's essence had seeped into every root, leaf, and stone, and that every sound reminded him of what had been lost. He stumbled upon a small clearing where the sunlight broke through. It was the same clearing where Taiwo and Sola had fallen. Kahind sank to his knees, the tears streaming freely now. He pressed his hands to the earth, whispering to the forest, to his brothers, and to his sister, promising that their memory would be carried forward. And as he rose, the forest seemed to breathe with him. He understood that Adunni's vengeance had ended not in cruelty, but in remembrance. Every tree, every shadow, every whisper carried her story, ensuring that her life, her suffering, and her justice would never be forgotten. Kahind emerged from the forest, shaken and weary. The village lay ahead, peaceful yet unervingly quiet, as if sensing the weight of what had occurred. Children paused in their play, elders looked up from their tasks, and animals watched silently. The forest had released him, but the lessons remained. He entered cautiously, seeing familiar faces twisted with unease. No one knew exactly what had happened, but they could feel the change, the invisible shadow of grief and power that had passed through the village. Kahind's heart ached, knowing he carried the burden of the truth alone. He approached the elder's hut, trembling but resolute. The village leaders listened, their faces pale, as Kahind recounted fragments of the forest, of his sister, and the wrath that had claimed his brothers. He left out the supernatural details, knowing some things were too vast for mortal minds, but he emphasized the moral, the cost of cruelty, betrayal, and forgetting. The villagers nodded solemnly. Though they could not fully understand the horrors, the lesson was clear. Adunni's memory must be honored, and no one must repeat the mistakes that led to her death. Kahind's voice shook, but it carried the weight of truth and sorrow that could not be ignored. As he walked through the village, he noticed children listening intently. Their wide eyes and careful movements mirrored the respect and caution the forest demanded. The story of Adunni, once a secret tragedy, was now a living lesson, passed into memory and whispered from heart to heart. Kahind became a storyteller. Around evening fires, he recounted the tale, soft and sorrowful, ensuring that every listener understood the danger of betrayal and the importance of memory. His voice carried grief, guilt, and reverence in equal measure. The elders of the village began to honor the forest. They left small offerings near the tree's edge, food, flowers, and carved symbols, paying tribute to the girl whose life and vengeance had transformed the land. Each act reinforced her memory and reinforced the sacredness of the forest. Children grew up hearing the story. They learned the lessons of compassion and justice, understanding that cruelty had consequences and that memory was powerful. Adunni's story became part of the moral fabric of the village, a living cautionary tale. The forest itself seemed to respond. Leaves swirled gently, the river shimmered in sunlight, and animals moved with a new sense of awareness, as if the spirit of Adunni remained among them, guiding, warning, and protecting. Kahind watched silently. Though his brothers were gone, their story would live on as part of Adunni's legacy, entwined with hers in the village and the forest alike. Kahind returned to the forest edge alone. Though peaceful, it was alive with memory. The twisting roots and shadows had not returned in malice, but in quiet acknowledgement. Every tree, every stone carried the weight of Adunni's existence, her sorrow, and the justice she demanded. He knelt in the clearing where Taiwo and Sola had fallen. He whispered to them, to his sister, and to the forest, promising remembrance. The wind carried his words softly, brushing against his face as if answering. "We hear you. We remember." Animals returned cautiously. They moved with awareness and grace, no longer afraid but respectful, as if sensing the spirit that lingered and the legacy she left behind. Kahind stood, eyes scanning the forest. He felt an unspoken pact with the land, a promise that her story would be carried forward and her memory honored. And the forest remained eternal, alive, quiet, and sacred, a monument to Adunni, the girl who had walked between life and death, whose wrath had transformed the world. Kahind began speaking to the village regularly. He shared the story with reverence, teaching not just fear but respect, compassion, and the consequences of cruelty. Every word carried his grief, his guilt, and his understanding of what had been lost. The villagers listened and honored the forest. Shrines were built, offerings left, and traditions emerged to remember Adunni. She became more than a ghost. She became a moral guardian, her memory woven into every act of respect toward life and each other. Children were taught the value of memory. They learned that every action mattered, that betrayal had weight, and that the past could never truly be erased. Her story became legend, terrifying yet enlightening. Kahind watched over the forest and village alike. He felt her presence in every shadow, leaf, and breeze, a reminder of the thin line between vengeance and justice. Years passed, but the story endured. The village thrived, guided by the memory of Adunni. Her life, suffering, and wrath became a compass for morality and compassion. The forest remained sacred. Villagers and travelers alike approached it with reverence, leaving offerings, whispering prayers, and teaching children about the girl whose memory shaped their world. Kahind grew old, yet remained vigilant. He often stood at the forest's edge, listening to whispers of wind and shadow, feeling the pulse of her presence in the land itself. The story of Adunni became eternal. Her vengeance had ended, but her lesson lived on, transforming grief into wisdom, sorrow into guidance, and death into remembrance. Each year, the villagers gathered at the forest edge. Candles were lit, songs were sung, and offerings laid in honor of Adunni. The children placed flowers and carved small wooden figures, learning respect for life and the weight of actions. Kahind led the ceremony. His voice, now older and steadier, recounted the story carefully, blending sorrow and reverence. He reminded everyone that memory was sacred and that cruelty left permanent scars on the living and the land. The forest responded. A gentle breeze moved the branches, carrying the scent of flowers and whispers of acknowledgement, as if Adunni herself was watching and approving. Villagers left renewed in their understanding. They understood that life, memory, and justice were intertwined, and that the spirit of Adunni lived on in every act of honor and remembrance. Kahind stood alone at the forest edge, older now, gray in hair, but resolute. The clearing where Taiwo and Sola had fallen was quiet, yet alive with the memory of his sister. He placed his hand on a stone and whispered, "Adunni, I will never forget you." The forest seemed to breathe in response. Leaves rustled gently, the river sparkled, and shadows lingered softly without menace. The story had come full circle, justice, memory, and peace intertwined. The village thrived in reverence and care. Adunni's story was no longer just tragedy. It was wisdom, guiding generations in respect, compassion, and remembrance. Kahine smiled through tears. Her wrath had ended, but her memory had become eternal. And in the forest, in the village, and in their hearts, she would never be forgotten. The wind whispered softly, "Remember me, forever." Please subscribe, share, like, and comment for more videos.